Okay, ladies, gentlemen, comrades, distinguished guests, good morning.
Good morning.
That's a bit weak. Let's try that. Ladies, gentlemen, distinguished guests, comrades, good morning.
Good morning.
Right, without further ado, the two back rows are going to come forward. Come on, stand up, come forward. Even the three back rows, come forward. Lots of space in here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to be here at this very seminal conference. It marks what I hope is an ongoing and forward-moving dialogue between Manchester Metropolitan University and the community in whom. And it couldn't be more appropriate, partly because we live in a time of great change in educational policy and practice, as Andy's touched on, and partly because there is going to be this £139 million development in whom, which I think opens in 2014. Okay, good. Well, the purpose of my few remarks this morning is to talk broadly around education and black and working class children. And as Ornette indicated, for very many years, almost since I first became a Member of Parliament, one of my passions has been the issue of education and doing what I can to make sure that every single child in all of our schools, up and down the country, achieves their full potential. Now, nowadays, whenever I'm asked to speak, people say, oh, Diane Abbott, who needs no further introduction. So let me introduce myself. My name is Diane Abbott. I'm a Member of Parliament for Hackney North and Stony, which is a very diverse area in North London. I've been a Member of Parliament for 25 years. And when I was elected in 1987, it was, I think, the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, and I was the first ever black woman elected. And so, in a sense, my election showed that despite the best efforts of those with a vested interest in the status quo, the arc of history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. And I always say that if, when I was the age of some of the children in the audience, if that chubby, bespectacled, obstreperous, mouthy, disruptive little black girl could grow up to be a Member of Parliament, anything is possible. Just to fill you in on my background, my family, my mother and father came to this country from Jamaica in the 1950s. They were some of the earliest post-war Caribbean migrants to this country. My mother was a pupil nurse, and my father was a sheet metal worker. And as it happened, they had been born and brought up in the same village in rural Jamaica. It's a little dusty village in the green hills of Mocha in Clarendon, and it's called Smithville. They were brought up together, knew each other as children, came to London, met each other, and married. Now, as I say, my mother was a pupil nurse who stopped nursing for a period when she had my brother and I. My father worked in a factory. And I think if my parents could have had their dreams for their daughter fulfilled, they would have liked to see me become, a staff nurse. The fact that I became a Member of Parliament far overshot their aspirations However, my parents did bring me up to believe in education because they themselves believed in education, even though both of them had left school at 14. So I went to school in inner London. I went to one of the old-fashioned grammar schools where I did my GCE and my A-levels. I did the entrance exam for Cambridge University because that was the day, those were the days when if you wanted to get into Oxford or Cambridge, you actually had to sit a special exam. And not only did you have to sit a special exam, you also had to do a Latin exam. Not because I was studying Latin, but because if you wanted to do what they called an art subject, history, English, philosophy, anything that wasn't a science, if you wanted to do an arts subject in Cambridge and Oxford in the 80s, you had to sit Latin. Whether or not you dropped it, that was your problem. That wasn't the university's problem. So I sat the special exam to go to Cambridge at a point, sadly actually, when my parents' marriage had broken down. So as well as revising for my special exam and Latin, which I dropped a few years earlier, I was also cooking chicken and rice and peas on a Sunday for my family, but hey, there you go. And I was so fortunate as to pass the exam. And I was so fortunate as to read history at Cambridge. And then, as now, there were not more than a handful of black undergraduates in the university. So I graduated from Cambridge, became a graduate trainee in the civil service, went from the Home Office to work in the media. A lot of people think that I'm an MP that does a bit of media on the side. I'm actually a journalist who became a member of Parliament. So I worked in television, I worked in regional television, I worked in breakfast television. At one and the same time, I was active in my community and was elected as a councillor in the early 1980s. I became very involved in campaigning around issues of racial justice, within the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party. And in 1986, I was selected as the candidate for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, and many people actually thought I couldn't win. There'd never been a black woman in Parliament, ever, ever, ever. And I was supposed to be a very left-wing black woman, and even black people in Hackney didn't think I could win. But having been selected in '86 and campaigned very hard, both black people and white people campaigned very hard for my election. In 1987, I was elected to Parliament for the first time, and last year was my 25th anniversary. And as some of you may know, in 2010, I ran for the leadership of the Labour Party, and I'm now Shadow Public Health Minister. So that's a little bit about me. This is a very significant conference, and this is a very significant subject, because there is no issue more important both to our lives as individuals, but also the future of our communities in the 21st century, no issue more important than education. And education will be the difference between those countries and those economies that move forward in the 21st century, and those countries and those economies that stagnate. And allowing all of your population to achieve their educational potential will be the difference between those countries and economies that succeed and those countries and economies that fail. And there is no group of people for whom education is more of a passion than those persons of immigrant descent. And the reason I say this is because the generation, wherever you came from, but the generation that came to this country from former parts of the British Commonwealth often had to lead very hard lives. They came to a country which didn't have race relations legislation, so you could legally refuse to rent a room to somebody because you didn't like the colour of their skin. You could legally pay a black man and a white man working alongside different salaries just because the black man was black and there was nothing anybody could do about it. Black people were absent from the higher levels of many trades and crafts, let alone white-collar professions, and to build a life and to look after their family. That very first generation had to struggle in a way which is always worth reminding ourselves of. And very many of them were not able to fulfill their potential and their aspirations in their lifetime. But they believed as an article of faith, but that for their children and for their grandchildren, it would be better. That's how they sustained the long hours of work. That's how they've sustained the grim housing they had to live in. That's how they sustained the crude racism they often encountered on the street, in the workplace, even some of the churches they tried to join. They believed that for their children and grandchildren it would be better, and they believed that education would be the means and the instrument by which that would happen. So I begin my remarks by saying to you that immigrants, whether they're Jewish immigrants, West Indian immigrants, African immigrants, if they have one thing in common, it's a belief in education. And if there is one way in which this society has failed people of colour above all, it is the way the education system has failed our children. It is, in my view, a bigger betrayal than some of the issues in relation to the forces of the state, police and immigration. It is the biggest betrayal of all because actually what it does is betray a whole generation's hope for the future. Now, I say specifically that the education system has failed our children because there is a narrative and analysis about black and minority children in education which would suggest or would infer that the failure is with them. Failure is with them, not with the system. They don't want to work, if they opt out, if they get excluded, it's them, it's their youth culture, it's their community which is not interested in education. The failure lies with them. It is personal and cultural failure. And that's quite a fashionable narrative. And it's a useful narrative for the people that run our educational institutions because it takes the responsibility away from them. But it's a narrative I always challenge, whoever it comes from. It could come from educationalists, it could come from black so-called community leaders, I don't care. I challenge the notion that the issue around the education of BME young people is an issue about their personal, their community failure. I located within the institutions. Now you say to me, why do I say that? Let me remind you of the figures. When young African and Afro-Caribbean children join the school system aged 5, tests show that they're doing as well as white and Asian children. In fact, some tests would indicate that in some ways, developmentally, they're a little bit more advanced. By the age of 11, those children, particularly the boys, are dropping off. By the age of 16, you see a catastrophic failure, particularly in black boys' achievement. So if these children come into the school system, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed and doing as well as other children of other ethnicities, and if by the age of 16, a substantial number, particularly our boys, have failed, I put it to you that you cannot wholly absolve the system for responsibility as to what has happened. So what has happened? There'll be people here who are very expert and also. But I think one of the things that has happened is a culture of low expectations. I can't tell you the times I have gone into inner city schools in Hackney and other areas, and what you find is you will have, this was under the Labour Party system, you have a gifted and talented class, gifted and talented, who look nothing like me, and then a gardening squad, or girls that are being, offered nursery nursing, or, and they look like me. And even in Hackney, where you've had a minority community since immediately after the war, teachers don't seem to see what they're doing with that kind of sheep and goats thing. There's a culture of low expectations. I can remember when I was at grammar school, teachers saying to me, Diane, why aren't you good at netball? Because I was no good at sports. They said, but you West Indian girls, you're all good at netball, aren't you? Well, I'm afraid I was bad at netball and I enjoyed writing and poetry. I didn't fit the stereotype. I managed to survive not fitting the stereotype, but many of our children don't. I remember going from primary school, where actually I was known for my essay writing, and my essays used to be pinned up on the wall. It was one thing people knew I could do. To grammar school. And in my first class, in my English lesson, the English teacher, Miss Peck, never forgotten her name, Miss Peck gave out an essay writing assignment. So I thought, okay, I went home, I wrote this essay, I put it in. The next lesson, she announced the marks. So I sat back confidently, and she started announcing the grades and who'd got what grade. And she started from the top, and she did A+, and she did A, and she did A-, not mentioning my name so far. She mentioned B+, and I started to be baffled. Never could I ever remember getting more than B+ for an essay. B, B-, C+, C, C-. And then she stopped. So nervously, I put up my hand and said, Miss Peck, what about my essay? She said, I'll see you at the end of the lesson. So at the end of the lesson, she was on a platform, the desk was on a platform in front of the class. At the end of the lesson, I went up to her nervously, as she looked at me. She looked down at me, literally, because she was on a little platform. And she picked up my essay like this, dangled it in front of me and said, without missing a beat, she said, where did you copy this essay? Because I was the only black girl in the class, the only black girl in the grammar school, in fact, and she could not believe that this black girl in front of her could have written an essay like that. She just couldn't believe it. She didn't ask me, she didn't question me, she just said, where did you copy it? Now, what did I do? Did I challenge her? No. I was quite a confident child, but I was 11. What I did was, for the remainder of that year, I consciously wrote a little bit down. Didn't use some of the words I knew. I didn't want to invite that humiliation again. Now, fortunately for me, in the next year, I had another English teacher, Mrs. Landry, who believed in me and encouraged me, and I went forward from there. But the point of that anecdote is this: how you treat children and what your expectations of them are will shape what they're able to achieve. And if there is one thing that I am hawkish on, it is against a culture of low expectations. Sometimes it's dressed up as, oh, what do you expect? These deprived children, da, 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 da. How can you expect them to be able to... Well, listen to me now. My parents were of a generation brought up in rural Jamaica who left school at 14, although my mother stayed on a year or so as a pupil teacher. So you're talking about children educated in rural Jamaica, with rudimentary facilities. Each and every one of them could read and write. And in addition, they could recite you romance poetry, Keats, and so forth. People are nodding, they understand what that generation was like. Don't tell me that in one of the richest countries in the world, with millions of pounds of investment in schools, we have to produce black children who, when they turn 11, still can't read and write, let alone recite romance poetry. The arguments that you cannot expect core academic achievement from BME children rests on an underestimate of where they come from, rests on an underestimate of what their parents were taught, and rests on a culture of low expectations. So, and let me say, about 10 years ago, with the backing of the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who was a long-standing comrade of mine on the left, I was able to launch an initiative called London Schools and the Black Child. And we did a whole variety of things. But one of the things we did every year, until Boris became mayor, one of the things we did every year was we had a conference about black children education. I'll never forget the first one. We registered 1,200 people. Now, I'd planned for about 500 people, but we registered 1,200. And my staff said, well, Diane, we've registered 1,200. And I said, look, the conference is on a Saturday. There's no way all these people are going to turn up on a Saturday morning for a conference. We'll be fine. Lo and behold, when we got to the conference centre at 9, people were queuing up already. And in the course of the day, 1,500 people came through the door. Black people are passionate about education. Contrary to what educationists will tell you, they are passionate and they want to know how they can help and support their children. They want to understand, they want to connect, and educational institutions have to look to what they have failed to do to engage and connect. So I began by saying that there is no issue more important than education. I said that it was my view that the education system had largely failed people of colour. But at this point, let me just say something about issues in relation to class. Because alongside the notion that what you expect about BME children there is this notion in the education establishment that in some sense class is destiny. So alongside what you expect of BME children, it's also kind of what you expect of working class children. And you get educationalists saying, well, you know, these working class children, their disadvantages, you know, how can we as teachers and higher education institutions, how can we be expected to counteract all the problems, all the pressures, all the this and that happening? How can we, as mere schools and higher education institutions, be expected to counteract that? Well, of course they can. And the Victorians, who built some of these institutions, these buildings which now form Manchester Metropolitan, and the Victorians would have been amazed at the notion that education cannot counteract destiny. One thing about the Victorians, and there's, you know, they built some of the great municipal buildings in Manchester. One thing about the Victorians, they believed that education was a way of raising people up. They believed education was a way precisely of challenging the circumstances in which people lived and moving them ahead and forward. And it is extraordinary how common it is nowadays amongst education to say, you can't expect us to counteract what is happening, the crime, the blah, blah, blah. Of course you can. That's what education is for. So, education is important. Too many children of colour have been failed, and class is certainly not destiny. So what can be the role of higher education organisations like Manchester Metropolitan University, working with communities like the communities in whom? Well, first of all, we need to see strategies that involve the community and involve the community on the basis of equality, where appropriate, and with respect for people's cultures and backgrounds. We need to see institutions like MMU focusing on early intervention. It really isn't enough to go into schools when the children are aged 15 and 16 and wonder why more of them aren't applying to university. I've done a lot of work around particularly black boys and educational failure. And what the Americans and everyone that's looked into it says, there are three things. First of all, you have to work with the community. Secondly, you have to get these children before the age of 7. And thirdly, you have to have men in the classroom. So if an institution like MMU isn't intervening at a primary school level, already it has limited its effectiveness. If an institution like MMU isn't seeing what it can do to put men in primary school classrooms, whether as just lecturers that come in once a week to sit with the children and read, if they aren't seeing what they can do to put men in classrooms, then they will have failed. And if they're not working with communities, they will have failed also. So early intervention at primary school level is the key in both shaping young children's expectations and aspirations and plugging them in to the world of higher education. And I would say this, I think culture and cookery and all the rest is really important, but I'm always wary of taking our children into a wholly separate track, which ultimately takes them nowhere. I get a bit weary of going into schools with large numbers of black pupils that want to tell me about their steel band, fantastic, I like steel band music, and how all the picnic them is baking samosas, but cannot tell me about the GCSE levels of those children and how many of them go on to higher education. So culture has a vital role to play, and you'll hear about it in the course of the day, but it must always be knitted in to mainstream education, drawing the children into mainstream education and helping to shape both their pride in their self and their sense of what is possible. Early intervention, as I say, very important. And one of the things that institutions like MMU can learn from is the Saturday school movement. Saturday school movement is, I think, when I've spoken to ministers, both Labour ministers, Conservative ministers, Saturday school movement, I find very little understanding of it and the importance of it. As many of you will know, the Saturday school movement in this country really came of age in the 1970s and was very much to do with the politics of the era. The classic Saturday school, I know there's variants of it now, but the classic Saturday school was black-led, rooted in black culture, but also rooted in making sure these children got their core skills. One of the key things about it was it involved parents, it involved the community, And it acted both to anchor those children in their culture and a sense of pride, but also to make sure they achieved the core academic skills they needed to. And mainstream schools will say, how is it that these children do so well in Saturday schools, even sit down and listen in Saturday schools, and they don't sit down and listen in the mainstream school? Well, I think that mainstream schools and mainstream institutions like MMU need to learn from the Saturday school movement, in particular around the involvement of parents and also the engagement with issues of culture. So there's a lot, I think, Saturday schools have historically, since the 1970s, been an important form of community-based intervention that an institution like MMU can learn from. Moving forward, it would be so sad if MMU spent 139 million on a development in whom, and the development was like some spacecraft that had landed in the middle of the community, but the community itself had difficulty engaging with. And this is what makes this conference so important, because I hope that it's the beginning of a process of heightened engagement between the university and communities. And it's the right thing to do, not just because philosophically it's the right thing to do, but ultimately better engagement with communities will make MMU a stronger and better and enhanced educational institution. So my message to you this morning is education is vital, not just important, but vital, that there's a history of failure of institutions, not failure of communities, but there is a tradition of community resilience and self-help. And also there are children, working class children out there doing very well despite everything. So institutions have failed in the past, but that doesn't mean there has to be failure in the future. Class is not destiny. Cooperation, not to find cul-de-sacs that you can put our children in, but cooperation to bring our children in and their families and communities into mainstream education is key. Early intervention, what can be done to offer support and help community institutions like Saturday schools is also key. And we as a community also have to have an articulated strategy. Sometimes in the past, we could be bought off with what they call in Jamaica, licky-licky. All right? You get a little grant, just a little one. You get to meet some big important people and grin up with them. And yeah, and on that level of licky-licky, we backed off from broader and more strategic demands. I have a message for the educational establishment, and it's a message that I have taken forward year on year, whether it's in the media or whether it wasn't, but taking it forward year on year. But I also have a message for the community, and the message is this, that no one in society is going to give you anything. You have to come together to take it. And as you come together to take it, the point is not that you are begging charity. The point is not that you are begging people to be kind and Christian to you. The point is that you are asking for justice. You look at a city like London, you look at a city like Manchester. Why do you think, in its heyday, Manchester was one of the industrial capitals of the world? Why do you think that Manchester was so rich and powerful and could throw up some of the municipal buildings you see today? It was the glories of empire. And what was the British Empire built on, if not the profit from slavery? You know, I often tell people in London, you look at those wonderful buildings in London, and remember, It is the profit from the traffic in human bodies, those profits that were recycled into the banks and early financial formations of the Industrial Revolution. So when we come asking justice around education, not asking for charity, asking for what we are entitled to. So let us not be bought off with licky-licky. Let us not allow them, and I use the phrase advisedly, to play divide and rule. Let us come together, let us be united, let us have a strategy, let us keep our eyes on the prize, because it's not just that we as a community deserve it, it is our responsibility to generations yet to come. Thank you very much.